The Murder at Thornfield Hall, a Miss Marple mystery. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Miss Marple read it twice at the breakfast table, her boiled egg growing cold beside her, and then set it down on the linen cloth and looked out at her garden for quite some time. It was from Sir Edmund Hartley. She had not expected that. Sir Edmund was not a man who wrote letters to elderly spinsters unless he wanted something, and even then he generally had his secretary do it. She had met him perhaps 4 times over the years, at the Prentice wedding, at the church fete in 1961, and twice more at functions she could no longer precisely recall. He had always been perfectly civil, correctly and at a distance. The letter was short. Dear Miss Marple, I am hosting a small gathering at Thornfield Hall this coming Friday through Sunday. A handful of guests, nothing elaborate. I find myself in need of quiet company. I hope you will do me the honor of attending. A car will be sent. No explanation, no particular warmth. Just the quiet assumption that she would come. She would, of course. Thornfield Hall sat at the northern edge of St. Mary Mead, past the Dixon farm and the old mill pond, behind a stand of copper beeches that had been there longer than anyone could remember. Miss Marple had walked past its gates many times without being invited through them. The grounds were large but not ostentatious, the settled, unremarked largeness of old money. The car came at 2:30 on Friday, a dark green Rover, driven by a young man who did not volunteer his name, and answered her questions about the other guests with a perfect blankness that suggested instruction. Miss Marple sat in the back with her knitting bag on her lap and watched the familiar fields give way to the long gravel drive. Sir Edmund met her in the entrance hall. He was older than she remembered, or perhaps simply tireder. He had the look of a man who had been sleeping badly for several weeks. His greeting was correct, his attention to her comfort genuine, but something kept pulling his gaze sideways, toward some other thought he could not quite leave alone. Miss Marple, he said, taking her hand. Very good of you to come. It is very good of you to invite me, she said pleasantly. What a lovely house. It was a lovely house. High ceilings, old oak floors, the smell of beeswax and something beneath it, damp stone, old fabrics, that no amount of beeswax quite covered. The entrance hall had a fireplace large enough to stand in, and a painted portrait above it of a woman in Edwardian dress who watched the room with an expression of mild, permanent displeasure. The other guests were already assembled in the drawing-room for tea. Gerald Hartley, Sir Edmund's nephew, his brother's boy, was 34 or 35. He shook Miss Marple's hand warmly and called her delightful within the first 40 seconds of their introduction, which told her several things at once. He had an easy charm that looked effortless and wasn't. Constance Hartley, Sir Edmund's sister, sat slightly apart from the group with her teacup held in both hands. She was 10 years younger than her brother, and had spent most of those years being overlooked in his company. She said little, unless directly addressed, and when she did speak, there was a dryness to it that people tended to mistake for wit. Mr. Fenn, the solicitor from London, was a neat, contained man of 50 or so. He listened to the conversation while appearing to be thinking about something else entirely. He had very clean hands. Miss Marple noticed that particularly. And then there was Dorothy Vane. Dorothy was young, perhaps 26, with a round, open face and a stillness that was not quite serenity. She had been Lady Hartley's nurse in the final year of that lady's life, and Lady Hartley had died the previous autumn. Dorothy had remained in the house since then, in some vague, undefined capacity. It was the sort of arrangement that people fell into in large houses and that never ended as simply as it began. Miss Marple accepted her cup of tea and listened and said very little. The weather, the state of the roads. Gerald made a remark about some difficulty with a planning application in the village. Constance said nothing unless spoken to, and then only briefly. Sir Edmund sat in the high-backed chair nearest the window. He smiled when smiled at. He responded when spoken to. He ate half a scone and put the rest down. Once, for just a moment, Miss Marple caught him looking at Dorothy Vane, with an expression she could not immediately name. It was not affection. It was not anger. It was closer to the look a man wears when he has finally understood something he wished he had not needed to understand at all. Outside, the copper beeches were quite still. There was no wind. Miss Marple set down her cup and picked up her knitting. Dinner was at 7:30, and by 6 the house had settled into that particular pre-evening quiet where every sound carried further than it should. A door closing somewhere upstairs, water moving through old pipes, the tick of the long case clock in the hall, which was running 3 minutes fast, a detail Miss Marple had confirmed against her own watch and filed away without knowing quite why. She had been given a room on the first floor, east-facing, with a view over the kitchen garden. It was a good room, well aired, the bed properly made, a small vase of dried honesty on the window-sill. Someone had thought to put a hot water bottle under the coverlet. She did not know who. She made a note to find out. She changed for dinner and came down early, as was her habit, and found the drawing-room empty except for Constance Hartley, who was standing at the drinks tray with her back to the door. "Oh," Constance said, turning. She had not heard Miss Marple come in. "I thought I was alone." "So you were a moment ago," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Shall I go back out?" "No, of course not." Constance set down the decanter. She had poured herself a small whiskey, and she picked it up again with the directness of someone who had decided not to be embarrassed about it. "Sit down, please. It's a draughty house. Always has been." Miss Marple sat. Constance remained standing, which was itself a small thing worth remembering. "You've known my brother long?" Constance asked. "Not well. We've met at various occasions over the years. He was kind enough to invite me. He's always been hospitable." A pause. "When it suited him." Miss Marple looked up from settling her skirt. Constance was looking at the window, not at her, and her expression was quite controlled. Too controlled, perhaps, for a casual remark about a brother's hospitality. "I imagine it's been a difficult year," Miss Marple said. "Losing Lady Hartley." "Helena." Constance said the name in a specific way, not fondly, not harshly, but with the flatness of someone who has rehearsed neutrality on the subject for so long it has become automatic. Yes, Edmund took it very hard, or appeared to. She stopped herself then, took a sip of whiskey. "I'm sorry," she said. "That was ungenerous." Miss Marple said nothing. She had found over many years that saying nothing was frequently more productive than saying something, and considerably less effort. Gerald came in at 6:15 with the small weather of a man who fills rooms with his own momentum. He had changed into a dark jacket, and he looked, in the lamplight, very well presented. He poured himself a drink, offered one to Miss Marple. She declined, and embarked on a story about a friend's shooting weekend in Shropshire that had gone wrong in some complicated way, involving a borrowed Labrador. It was not a particularly interesting story, but he told it with enough energy that it did not matter, and by the time Mr. Fenn appeared in the doorway it had run its course, and everyone seemed in reasonable spirits. Mr. Fenn did not pour a drink. He sat in the chair nearest the fireplace and folded his hands in his lap and asked Miss Marple whether she had come far. "Only from the village," she said. St. Mary Mead. He seemed to place it or to place her. Edmund speaks of it fondly. It's a small village. People tend to feel one way or the other about small villages. "And you?" "I find them rather instructive," she said. He smiled at that. a brief, considered smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He had very careful eyes, Mr. Fenn, the kind that watched exits. Dorothy Vane came down last, just before Sir Edmund himself. She wore a grey dress that was perfectly appropriate and entirely forgettable, and she sat at the far end of the sofa and declined Gerald's offer to freshen her glass with a small shake of her head. She did not appear ill at ease exactly. She appeared absorbed. The way a person looks when they are running through a private conversation in their head for perhaps the fourth or fifth time, testing what was said against what was meant. Sir Edmund appeared at 7:20. He had dressed carefully. His colour was not good. He was a large man gone somewhat grey, and the evening light did him no favours. But he stood in the doorway and surveyed his guests with what was almost warmth, and Miss Marple thought for a moment she saw what he must have been like 20 years ago, when the house was fuller, and the reasons for filling it less complicated. He looked briefly at Dorothy. Dorothy looked at her hands. Gerald said something hearty about the evening being cold, and they all agreed that it was. And Sir Edmund crossed the room to the drinks tray and poured himself a small brandy, and stood with it for a moment without drinking. Miss Marple watched him. Then she looked at the mantelpiece. On it sat a large arrangement of dried flowers, grasses and seed heads and a few dried rosebuds, in a shallow pewter bowl. It was the sort of arrangement that had been there long enough to have grown invisible to the people who lived in the house. She looked at it, and then she looked away and picked up her knitting. Dinner was announced. They went through. The soup was a good brown onion, and the lamb that followed it was better, and by the time Mrs. Pruitt, the cook, a wide, unhurried woman who had apparently been at Thornfield Hall since before anyone could remember, brought in the pudding, the conversation had loosened somewhat, not warmly. But the surface tension had eased in the way it does when people have eaten, and the wine has gone round twice, and everyone has agreed, at least tacitly, to leave the difficult things alone until morning. Gerald had monopolized the better part of dinner. He was good at it, not rudely, but with the practiced ease of a man who had learned early that talking prevented other people from asking questions. He spoke about London, about a development project he was involved with, about the difficulty of finding reliable contractors. Miss Marple listened with every appearance of polite interest, and noted that he did not once ask his uncle a direct question, though Sir Edmund sat at the head of the table 8 feet away. Mr. Fenn spoke when spoken to, and ate with the methodical attention of a man for whom meals were primarily fuel. He had the habit, she noticed, of glancing at Sir Edmund whenever Gerald said something particularly expansive, not a glance of amusement, not of irritation. More like checking something, a small, reflexive verification. Constance ate her lamb and said 4 things the entire meal, 2 of which were requests to pass the salt. Dorothy sat to Sir Edmund's left and was the only person at the table who seemed genuinely attentive to him. She asked whether the lamb was to his liking. She noticed when his water glass needed filling before the housemaid did. These were not the gestures of a nurse still working. They were the gestures of someone who had simply become, through long habit, responsible for another person's comfort, and had not yet found a way to stop. Sir Edmund accepted all of it with a gentleness that surprised Miss Marple slightly. He was not, from what she knew of him, a gentleman by temperament. He was a correct man. There was a difference. After dinner they returned to the drawing-room. Sir Edmund excused himself at 9:30, citing tiredness and a letter he needed to write, and said good night with the slightly formal courtesy of a man performing a role he had taken on long ago and could not quite put down. Gerald watched him go. Just for a moment, Before the expression was smoothed away, there was something in Gerald's face that was not grief, and was not affection, and was not quite either of the acceptable things you were supposed to feel watching an elderly uncle leave a room. Miss Marple looked at her knitting. The remaining four sat with their coffee. Gerald attempted to resurrect the Shropshire story from before dinner, but it had lost its energy without Sir Edmund in the room, and it died quietly after a few minutes. Mr. Fenn looked at the fire. Constance had picked up a book she was not reading. Dorothy said, quite suddenly, "He's not well." A small silence. "He hasn't been well for months," Constance said without looking up from her book. "He didn't need a doctor to tell him that." "He has seen a doctor," Dorothy said. Her voice was even. "Dr. Witherspoon came in September and again in November. I know when Dr. Witherspoon came," Constance said. Another silence of a different quality. Gerald set down his coffee cup. "Well, he's not a young man. None of us gets younger." He said it with a kind of cheerful finality, the verbal equivalent of closing a window, and Miss Marple thought it was the most revealing thing he had said all evening. Mr. Fenn had not moved during any of this. He was looking at the fire with his hands folded in his lap, and he might have been thinking about anything. When the silence had stretched long enough, he said, to no one in particular, "He seemed in reasonable spirits at dinner." "Yes," Dorothy said quietly. "He did." She stood then, and said she thought she'd retire early, and said good night to each of them by name, in order, which was a small formality that struck Miss Marple as characteristic of a person who was very careful always to be seen doing the correct thing. When Dorothy had gone, Constance put her book down properly for the first time. She looked at Gerald. "Has he said anything to you?" she asked. "About the arrangements." "Constance," Gerald said, "I'm asking a plain question. It isn't the time. It is always the time, or it is never the time with you, Gerald, and somehow nothing ever gets settled." She picked the book back up. "Never mind." Mr. Fenn studied the fire. Miss Marple finished the row she was on, counted her stitches once under her breath, and remarked that the pudding had been very good, and that she had always thought brown sugar made all the difference in a crumble, and the conversation, after a moment of startled realignment, moved gratefully toward cooking. She went to bed at 10. She lay awake for a little while, listening to the house settle and creak around her, and thought about the word arrangements, and the particular way Constance had said it, and what it was, precisely, that was never getting settled. Outside, the copper beeches made no sound at all. She heard the knock at 7:30. Not at her door. Somewhere along the corridor, 2 doors down, perhaps 3. A rapid, hard knock of the kind that people only produce when they have been standing outside a door for some time already. Working up to, Miss Marple lay still and listened. Then a voice. Dorothy's. The words were not clear, but the register was. Not alarm, not yet, but the careful, controlled tone of someone who is frightened, and has decided that being frightened loudly will not help. Miss Marple was dressed, and in the corridor inside 4 minutes, which she considered adequate. Dorothy was at the door to Sir Edmund's study. It was closed. She knocked again, sharply, and then tried the handle, and the handle did not move. "He always unlocks it by 7, Dorothy said, when she saw Miss Marple. She said it as though this fact were both important and somehow already too late. "He has his coffee in there. He's always unlocked it by 7. Has anyone sent for Mrs. Pruitt?" "Not yet. I didn't want to." She stopped. "Quite right," Miss Marple said. She tried the handle herself, which told her nothing she did not already know, and then leaned close to the keyhole. The key was in the lock on the other side. She could see dimly the far corner of the room through the gap beneath the door, the edge of a hearthrug, the leg of a chair. Gerald appeared at the end of the corridor in his dressing gown, hair disordered, squinting. "What's happened?" "The study is locked from inside," Miss Marple said. "Your uncle does not appear to be answering." Something moved across Gerald's face. It was fast, and she might have missed it in different light. He came down the corridor. It was Gerald who eventually went for the spare key, kept, apparently, in a tin box in the kitchen dresser, a fact he knew without being told where to look, and Gerald who opened the door, and Gerald who stepped inside first, which Miss Marple noted, and which she suspected he would later regret. Sir Edmund was in the chair behind his desk. He might have been sleeping. His chin was dropped toward his chest. His hands rested loosely on the arms of the chair, and the general arrangement of him had the boneless quality of deep sleep. On the desk beside him stood a brandy glass, empty, with a faint residue at the bottom. The fire had gone out some hours ago. The room was cold. Dorothy made a small sound and went to him. She put 2 fingers to his neck and held them there, and the stillness of her face during those few seconds told Miss Marple everything before Dorothy said quietly, "He's gone." Gerald stood in the middle of the room with his hands at his sides. Mr. Fenn appeared in the doorway. He must have heard the voices, and took in the scene with the particular economy of a man whose profession had trained him to register facts before feelings. Constance came behind him in her dressing gown, and when she saw her brother, she put one hand flat against the doorframe and leaned on it briefly. Then she straightened. "We should telephone, Doctor Witherspoon," Dorothy said. "And the police," Miss Marple said pleasantly. Everyone looked at her. "It seems the proper thing," she said, "when a death is unexpected." "He was not a well man," Constance said. Her voice was steady. "His heart has been a concern for over a year. This is not unexpected." "Not really." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Perhaps not." She said nothing more. She was looking at the mantelpiece. The pewter bowl with the dried flower arrangement was there, as it had been the previous evening. But it was not quite as it had been. Last night the tallest stems, 3 long dried grasses, had stood to the left of center, where the weight of the arrangement balanced naturally toward the window side. Now they were to the right. The bowl itself had been rotated or lifted and replaced at a slightly different angle. The dusty half-ring on the mantelpiece shelf, where it usually sat, was visible at the edge. A clean arc of darker wood, where the bowl no longer covered it. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that happened when someone picked something up and put it back down again in a hurry, or in the dark, or while attending to something else entirely. She looked at it for 3 seconds, and then looked away. Dr. Witherspoon arrived within the hour, a compact, conscientious man who examined Sir Edmund with the thoroughness of someone who had known him for 20 years. He confirmed death. He noted the brandy glass. He asked whether Sir Edmund had complained of chest pains, and Dorothy said yes occasionally, and the doctor nodded with the expression of a man whose expectations had been met. "Heart failure," he said, "consistent with his history." He looked around the room. "A peaceful end, all things considered." "Yes," said Gerald. "Poor old Edmund." Miss Marple, who was standing just inside the door, shifted her gaze from the brandy glass to the window, to the flower arrangement, and back to Gerald. Gerald was looking at the floor with an expression of appropriate sorrow. She thought about the smell she had noticed when she first stepped into the room. Faint. Already dispersing in the cold air. Something slightly sharp beneath the leather and wood smoke and old paper. She had smelled it once before, long ago in very different circumstances. She had not forgotten it. She picked up her knitting bag from where she'd set it by the door, and went quietly to find some breakfast. Breakfast was a subdued fare, which was to be expected. and yet the subdued quality of it was not quite the same for each person at the table, which was more interesting. Gerald ate well. He had toast and kedgeree and 2 cups of coffee, and he held his fork with the relaxed grip of a man whose appetite had not suffered. And he spoke in a low, suitable voice about the practicalities. Who would need to be notified? Whether the weekend guests ought to leave today, or wait until Monday? What Mrs. Pruitt's instructions should be regarding the household for the coming week. All of it was correct. All of it was the sort of thing that needed saying, and yet the briskness beneath it, the slight efficiency, the sense of a man who had already begun thinking about what came next, was there if you were looking. Constance drank coffee and did not eat. She sat with both hands around her cup and looked at the window and occasionally answered Gerald's practicalities with a word or 2. Once she said, with a flatness that stopped the conversation briefly, "He should have had a better winter." No one quite knew how to respond to that, and after a moment, Gerald said something about the weather having been particularly hard this year, and the moment passed. Mr. Fenn had brought a small leather notebook to the table, which he had not opened, but which sat beside his plate with the quiet insistence of something that wanted to be noticed. He ate sparingly, half a piece of toast, a cup of tea, and when Gerald raised the question of the will, and when it might suitably be read, Mr. Fenn said that these things were generally handled within a fortnight, and that there was no urgency. And something in the way he said, "no urgency," suggested that he had already given the matter a good deal of thought. Dorothy did not come to breakfast at all. Miss Marple mentioned this to Mrs. Pruitt when she encountered her in the corridor outside the dining room. She had gone out, ostensibly to ask about hot water for her room. Miss Vane had a tray sent up, Mrs. Pruitt said. She was carrying a stack of folded linen, and she said it the way practical women say difficult things, matter-of-factly, because the fact was there whether you spoke it gently or not. She was very fond of Sir Edmund in her way. Yes, Miss Marple said, I thought she might be. She went upstairs afterward, not to her own room but along the east corridor, which gave onto a small landing with a window overlooking the kitchen garden. From here she could see the garden wall, old red brick, perhaps 8 feet high, and beyond it the stand of beeches, still and bare. She stood at the window for a little while. The garden below was tidy in the winter way, cut back, mulched, waiting. Along the far wall someone had trained an espalier apple tree, and beside it, about 2/3 along, a section of the brickwork was slightly different in color. Newer mortar, or repointed, or both. She noted it without moving from the window. Inspector Dryden arrived at 10:30. He was a large, capable man from the county constabulary, not unkind, with the manner of someone who had attended enough unexpected deaths in large houses to have formed a working theory about them. His working theory, it quickly became apparent, was that elderly men with heart conditions died of heart failure, and the sooner everyone could be allowed to get on with their lives, the better. He spoke to each guest in turn in the morning room. Miss Marple waited her turn with her knitting and listened to the quality of the silences between the closed door and the corridor. Gerald's interview lasted 11 minutes. He came out looking the same as he went in. Constance's lasted 7. She came out, saw Miss Marple in the corridor, and said, "He's satisfied it was natural causes," which it was. She said it once firmly, in the way of someone establishing a position. "Of course," Miss Marple said. Mr. Fenn's lasted 9 minutes. He did not look at Miss Marple when he came out. Dorothy's lasted 14. When she emerged, her eyes were red, which was the first time Miss Marple had seen anything of that kind from her, and she went directly to the stairs without speaking to anyone. Miss Marple's own interview lasted 6 minutes. Inspector Dryden was perfectly pleasant. He asked how she had known Sir Edmund, how long she had been a guest, whether she had heard anything unusual in the night. She answered each question honestly and completely. She did not mention the flower arrangement. She did not mention the smell. She did not mention Gerald's familiarity with the spare key, or the leather notebook, or the word arrangements, and the way Constance had deployed it the previous evening. There was a time for things, and this was not it. After the inspector had gone, she put on her coat and hat and went out into the kitchen garden. The cold was considerable, but she had her gloves, and she walked slowly, looking at the espalier apple tree, and then at the section of repointed brickwork beside it. She did not touch anything. She simply looked. Then she went back inside for her elevances, because she had had very little breakfast and the morning had been a long one. The afternoon came in grey and still, and Miss Marple spent the better part of it in the sitting-room, with her knitting and her ears open. This was, she had found over many years, the most productive arrangement available to a woman of her age and appearance. People did not moderate themselves around elderly ladies who knitted. They moderated themselves around policemen, around solicitors, around anyone who might write something down or repeat it in a context that mattered. An old woman with wool and needles was, to most people, approximately equivalent to a piece of furniture, present, inoffensive, and almost certainly not listening. She was always listening. Gerald came through the sitting-room at 2:30, on his way from somewhere to somewhere else, and paused when he saw her. "Settling in all right, Miss Marple. Can I get you anything?" "I am perfectly comfortable, thank you. It is a very pleasant room," he lingered. She had noticed, without using that word, even to herself, that Gerald found it difficult to leave rooms without performing some small closing gesture, a joke or a remark that allowed him to feel he was departing on his own terms rather than simply going. "Rotten business," he said. "Poor old Edmund. Still, he wasn't in good shape. Dorothy will tell you. She saw it every day. She was very devoted to him," Miss Marple said. Gerald picked up a small bronze figure from the mantelpiece and turned it over in his hands, not looking at it. "She's been here rather a long time, actually. Since before Helena died, Edmund kept her on, which was generous. She had nowhere particular to go. How fortunate for her that he did. Yes." He put the bronze down in a slightly different position than he had found it, though of course the situation will change now. The house will need to be sorted. Staff, arrangements, all of that. He said it with the tone of a man raising a practical matter rather than a personal one, which was its own kind of information. "Of course," Miss Marple said. He went. She looked at the bronze figure, now sitting at a small angle from where it had been, and returned to her knitting. Constance came in at 3, with the specific purposefulness of someone who has decided to do something and is doing it before the decision can be revisited. She sat down across from Miss Marple and folded her hands in her lap. "You are a sharp woman," she said, not unkindly, as a fact. "I am an old woman who has lived in a small village for a very long time," Miss Marple said. "One notices things. Edmund invited you for a reason." Constance was looking at her directly. "He was not a man who did things without reasons." Miss Marple waited. "He was worried," Constance said. "In the last few weeks he was. Not himself. Distracted. He had his solicitor up twice, which was unusual. He changed things." She paused. "He changed his will. I don't know the particulars. He didn't tell me the particulars, which was itself a message of a kind." "Did he tell you why he changed it?" "No. He told me he had made some discoveries that required him to reconsider certain arrangements." She said the word without any of the previous evening's heat, flatly, now as a piece of reported speech. He said it in a way that made me think the discoveries were about Gerald. A small silence. "I see," Miss Marple said. "I don't know what Gerald has done," Constance said. "I want to be clear about that. I have my suspicions, but suspicions are not knowledge, and I am not going to sit here and accuse my nephew of something I cannot prove." She stood. "I am simply telling you what Edmund told me, because I think you already know there is something wrong, and I think you are the sort of person who will find out what it is, and I would rather you had the full picture." She went to the door and then stopped. "The flower arrangement on the study mantelpiece," she said. "Edmund hated dried flowers. Helena put that bowl there years ago, and he never moved it because she had liked it. But he always said it was a depressing object. He would not have touched it himself." She paused. "I thought you might want to know that." She left before Miss Marple could reply. Miss Marple sat for a moment with her knitting still in her hands. Not knitting, so Edmund had not rearranged the flowers, which meant someone else had, someone who had been in the study, before the body was found, or after Sir Edmund was past noticing, someone who had lifted the pewter bowl and replaced it in haste, attending to something else, something beneath it, or behind it, or near it on the shelf. She thought about that for a little while. Then she thought about Mr. Fenn, who had appeared in the study doorway that morning, with remarkable promptness for a man whose room was at the opposite end of the corridor. And she thought about Dorothy, whose interview with the inspector had lasted 14 minutes, and who had come downstairs that evening with red eyes and gone directly back up without speaking to a soul. Outside the sitting-room window, the light was already going. The copper beeches stood black against a pewter sky, perfectly still. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again and began a new row. She went out at first light on Sunday. This was not unusual behavior for Miss Marple. She had always been an early riser, and a garden in winter had its own particular interest. The shape of things without their leaves, the way frost settled differently on different soils, the small evidence of what had been doing what while no one was watching. She put on her coat and her stoutest shoes and took her time about it, because hurrying at her age was both undignified and counterproductive. The kitchen garden was empty. Mrs. Pruitt did not begin until 7, and the housemaid who did the fires was occupied inside. The cold was sharp and clean, and the grass was stiff with frost that had not yet decided whether to become something worse. Miss Marple walked the perimeter of the garden at a leisurely pace, pausing occasionally to examine something. A frost-damaged rosemary plant, the pruning on a cordon pear, in the manner of a woman, with a general interest in horticulture and no particular destination. When she reached the far wall and the espalier apple tree, she stopped and looked at it with every appearance of admiration. The repointed section of brickwork was 3 feet to the right of the tree, at approximately shoulder height. From a distance it was not obvious. Up close the mortar was visibly newer, lighter in color, with none of the gray bloom that decades of weather had given the original joints. Someone had done it carefully, but not recently enough for the repair to have fully weathered in. She pressed the bricks with her fingers, one by one, working along the row. The third one moved, not much. A fraction of an inch, the give of something not properly set, and behind it a hollow sound that the solid bricks on either side did not produce. She worked it gently. It was a matter of patience rather than strength, and after a minute it came free, and behind it was a space perhaps 6 inches deep and 8 inches wide, and in the space was a small leather diary, dark green, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had been folded around it with some care. Miss Marple did not open it immediately. She stood for a moment in the cold garden, with the wrapped diary in her gloved hands, and looked at the bare apple branches against the pale sky, and thought about the kind of man who hides something in a garden wall rather than locking it in a desk, a man who has a locked desk and does not trust it, a man who knows that the people who might look for what he has hidden will look in the obvious places first. She put the brick back as neatly as she could and went inside. In her room, with the door locked and her coat still on because the room was cold, she unwrapped the oilcloth and opened the diary. It was Sir Edmund's. The handwriting was his. She had seen his signature on the invitation letter, and the character of it was the same. Deliberate, slightly compressed, the hand of a man who had learned to write in an era when handwriting was taken seriously. The entries were not daily. Some weeks had nothing, others had several pages. She did not read everything. She read enough. The entries from October told her that Sir Edmund had begun to notice discrepancies in the estate accounts. Small ones at first, amounts that might have been errors, transpositions, the ordinary small mistakes of paperwork. He had not raised it immediately. He was. She understood from the tone of the entries, a man who preferred to be certain before he spoke. By November he was certain. Gerald had been drawing against the estate accounts, using documents that bore Sir Edmund's signature. The signature was not Sir Edmund's. He wrote this plainly, without apparent emotion. The signature on the November transfer is not mine, nor on examination is the one from August. Gerald has been doing this for at least 18 months. I do not yet know the full extent. And then, 2 pages later, a shorter entry. Fenn knew. He must have known. The transfers went through his office. I cannot prove he instructed it, but I cannot believe he did not see it. I will need to think carefully about how to proceed. Miss Marple turned the page. The final entry was dated 4 days before the weekend gathering. It was the longest in the diary, and the most careful, and it began, "Dorothy came to me this morning. She has known for some time. She found a letter in Gerald's room in October, quite by accident, and has been frightened of what to do with it. I am glad she told me. I am not glad about the rest of it. The rest of it was this. Dorothy had seen Constance reading the letter before Dorothy found it. Not reading, photographing it, with the small camera she kept in her cardigan pocket for her garden records. Constance had put it back. She had said nothing to anyone. I do not know what Constance intends, Sir Edmund had written. She has always felt the estate should have come to her in larger part. Whether she means to use what she knows as leverage, or whether she is simply gathering information against a future need, I cannot say. I find I am less certain about her than I have ever been. I have changed the will accordingly. Fenn does not know this yet. I used Hargreaves in Milchester instead. Miss Marple closed the diary. She sat on the edge of the bed for a little while, in her coat, in the cold room, with the diary on her knee, and the frost still on her shoes. Then she stood, put the diary in her knitting bag beneath 2 balls of grey wool, and went downstairs to see about some toast. There were things she still needed to confirm. But the shape of it was there now, and the shape was not what Inspector Dryden thought it was. Not remotely. She found Dorothy in the conservatory. It was not a warm room. The boiler that served it had been unreliable for years, to judge by the rust stains on the ironwork. But it was a private one, and Dorothy was sitting on a slatted wooden bench between 2 large terracotta pots of dormant agapanthus, with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the glass roof and the grey sky beyond it. She did not look startled when Miss Marple came in. She looked, if anything, as though she had been waiting for someone to come, and had not much minded who. "May I sit?" Miss Marple asked. Dorothy moved along the bench without speaking. They sat together for a moment. The conservatory smelled of cold earth, and something faintly green, the particular smell of plants enduring rather than growing. Outside, a wood pigeon was making its repetitive, hopeless inquiry to the bare trees. "You were with Sir Edmund a long time," Miss Marple said. 2 years and 4 months. Dorothy said it precisely, the way nurses often did. Time measured in the professional sense, in shifts and medications and the slow changes that accumulate into a life, declining. I came when Lady Hartley was first diagnosed. I stayed after. He was good to you. He was. A pause. He was not an easy man. He was correct rather than warm, if you understand the difference. But he was honest, and he was fair. Those are rarer than people think. Miss Marple said nothing. The wood pigeon continued outside. "He told me," Dorothy said, "about Gerald, about the accounts." She looked at her hands. He'd known for some weeks when he told me. He wanted to know if I had seen anything. Anyone going through his papers, anything unusual in the post. I told him about the letter I had found in Gerald's room in October. I should have told him sooner. I know that. "You were frightened." "I was frightened of being wrong," she said, which was a more precise answer, and a more honest one. "Gerald is. He's very convincing. When I found the letter I thought, perhaps I've misunderstood. Perhaps there is an explanation." Gerald could always produce explanations. She said this last thing without particular bitterness, which made it worse somehow. "When you told Sir Edmund about the letter," Miss Marple said carefully, "did you also tell him what you had seen regarding Miss Constance?" Dorothy was quiet for a moment. A long moment. "Yes," she said. "And what did he say?" "He didn't say very much at all. He asked me to describe exactly what I had seen. When, where, which pocket she put the camera in. He wrote it down." She paused. He looked very tired afterward. Not surprised, just tired. Miss Marple thought about the diary entry. "I find I am less certain about her than I have ever been." "Did Constance know that you had seen her?" Miss Marple asked. Dorothy turned her head. It was the first time she had looked directly at Miss Marple since the conversation began, and her expression was careful in the way of someone who has been carrying something awkward for too long and is deciding whether to put it down. "I think so," she said. "I was in the doorway of the library when I saw her. I stepped back, but the door was ajar, and she paused before she left the room. Just for a second. The way you pause when you think you might have been observed." Dorothy looked away again. "I don't know if she saw me. I don't know what she made of it if she did." The wood pigeon had stopped. The conservatory was very quiet. "Miss Vane," Miss Marple said, "on the night Sir Edmund died, did you hear anything? From the study or from the corridor outside it?" Dorothy's hands tightened slightly in her lap. "I heard a door," she said. "I wasn't certain which one. I'd been sleeping badly and I wasn't fully awake. It might have been the pipes. The pipes in this house make extraordinary sounds. But it was a door. Somewhere between midnight and 2. I didn't get up. I thought," she stopped, "I thought it was Edmund himself, perhaps, going to his study. He did that sometimes when he couldn't sleep." "Which side of your room is the corridor on?" "The left, and Sir Edmund's study is to the left along the corridor." "Yes. And Miss Constance's room?" A pause. "Also to the left, further along." Miss Marple nodded once, very slightly, as though something had confirmed itself that she had not quite been sure of. "I should have gotten up," Dorothy said. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was the kind that cost something. "If I had gotten up, you could not have known," Miss Marple said. "And very likely it would have made no practical difference. These things are planned to prevent interference." Dorothy looked at her. "You know what happened to him?" It was not quite a question. "I have a reasonably clear picture," Miss Marple said. There are one or two things I want to be certain of before I say anything definite. But yes, I do not think Sir Edmund's heart failed him, Miss Vane. I think he was helped." Dorothy closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, the red was back. Not tears exactly, but the particular brightness that precedes them in people who are determined not to cry. "Gerald," she said. The name came out flat and certain. "Not Gerald," Miss Marple said gently. Dorothy stared at her. Then she stopped. Her face went through something complicated and arrived somewhere that was not quite disbelief and not quite understanding, but was partway between the two. "Oh," she said, very quietly. "Oh." Miss Marple stood, straightening her coat. "I think," she said, "that you should not be alone this evening. Stay near Mrs. Pruitt if you can manage it. And do not say anything to anyone about our conversation." She left Dorothy sitting on the bench between the agapanthus pots, looking at the cold glass roof and the pewter sky beyond it, with the expression of someone who has just understood something they very much wished they hadn't. Sunday lunch was cold cuts and a good potato soup, and they ate it with the particular quietness of people who have run out of safe subjects and have not yet decided whether to venture into the unsafe ones. Gerald had been on the telephone that morning, twice, that Miss Marple had heard, and possibly a third time from the study, though she could not be certain of that one. He came to lunch slightly late and slightly distracted, and ate with less appetite than he had managed at breakfast, which was itself a small reversal worth noting. Mr. Fenn had asked, at some point before lunch, whether it might be appropriate to begin a preliminary review of the estate documents. Purely as a practical matter, he said, to assist the family in understanding what would need to be handled in the coming weeks. Gerald had agreed immediately. Constance had said nothing. Miss Marple, who was passing through the hall at the time, and heard this exchange through the open morning-room door, had found it interesting that Mr. Fenn had asked Gerald rather than Constance, and that neither of them had mentioned that Sir Edmund had recently engaged a different solicitor entirely. They did not know about Hargreaves in Milchester. That much was clear, which meant they did not know about the new will, which meant that whatever they thought they had secured by removing Sir Edmund, they had not secured it at all. Miss Marple helped herself to a second bowl of soup and thought that there was a particular kind of irony in that, and that Sir Edmund, wherever he was, might have appreciated it. After lunch, the household dispersed. Gerald went back to the telephone. Mr. Fenn retreated to the morning-room with his leather notebook, now open. Dorothy remained in her room. Mrs. Pruitt could be heard in the kitchen, engaged in the steady, grounding business of washing up. Constance was in the drawing-room. Miss Marple went to join her. She settled into the chair she had occupied the previous afternoon, arranged her knitting, and said nothing for several minutes. Constance was at the writing desk near the window, working through what appeared to be household correspondence, bills or letters or both. The scratch of her pen was the only sound. Presently Miss Marple said, in a perfectly conversational tone, "I had a letter from my nephew Raymond last week. He is a novelist, you know. He says the most interesting thing about writing a mystery is that the cleverest criminals always make one assumption they ought not to have made." Constance's pen continued moving. "He says," Miss Marple went on placidly, "that they plan everything with great care, the method, the timing, the appearance of it. And then they assume that because the plan has gone smoothly, it has gone completely. They don't consider that someone else may have been planning rather longer than they have. The pen slowed, just fractionally. How interesting, Constance said. Her voice was even. I thought so. Raymond is very clever about these things. Miss Marple turned her knitting. He also says, and I thought this rather astute, that the thing which most often undoes a careful person is not a mistake they made, but a precaution they forgot. Something that was moved when it ought not to have been moved. Something that was seen when it was not meant to be seen. The pen stopped. Constance sat with it resting on the page for a moment. Then she set it down, with the deliberateness of someone making a decision about something larger than a pen, and turned in her chair. You are talking about the flowers, she said. Miss Marple looked up with an expression of mild inquiry. On the mantelpiece, Constance said. In the study. Her voice had changed, not dramatically, not into anything that could be called a confession, but the social surface of it had gone. What was underneath was quieter and harder and considerably more real. You noticed they had been moved. Edmund always hated dried flowers, Miss Marple said. You mentioned that yourself. Something crossed Constance's face. It might have been the recognition that she had in fact handed Miss Marple that particular piece of information herself the previous afternoon, and what that meant about how much Miss Marple had already known when she did so. I see, she said. You were testing me. I was confirming something, Miss Marple said, which was more precise. Constance turned back to the window. The light outside was flat and white, and gave her face a drained, careful look. She was quiet for long enough that Miss Marple had completed another full row before she spoke again. Edmund was going to ruin Gerald, she said. He had all the evidence. He was going to go to the police. Gerald would have gone to prison. She paused. I know what you think of that as a motive. It isn't why I did it. Miss Marple waited. He changed the will, Constance said. He told me the Thursday before you all arrived. He had changed it to leave the estate in trust, charitable purposes, some foundation Helen had cared about. Gerald would receive nothing as punishment. And she stopped. I was to receive the same modest sum he had always allocated me, the same sum he had given me for 30 years, adjusted for inflation, as though I had not been here, as though I had not managed this house, stayed in this village, given up. She did not finish the sentence. You had given up a great deal, Miss Marple said. Everything, Constance said simply. And he left it to a foundation. The word landed in the room and stayed there. The cyanide, Miss Marple said after a moment. Where did you obtain it? Constance glanced at her. There was something almost like relief in it. The garden shed. Edmund used it years ago for wasps. The tin had been there since before Helena died. I had seen it when I was looking for the secateurs. She looked at her hands. I put it in the brandy decanter earlier that day, while he was resting. A small amount in the decanter rather than the glass. I thought it would be less specific. He always had his brandy in the evenings. He had done for 40 years. And the flowers? Miss Marple asked. Why move them? There was a letter behind the bowl, Constance said quietly, from Hargreaves, confirming the new will. Edmund had left it there. I don't know why. Perhaps he meant to deal with it and forgot. I took it. I thought if no one knew about Hargreaves, the old will would stand. She paused. I didn't know he'd written it all down as well. No, Miss Marple said. I rather thought you didn't. Outside, the copper beeches were perfectly still against a pewter sky, and the afternoon had gone very quiet. Constance picked up her pen again. She did not write anything. She simply held it. What happens now? She asked. "I think," Miss Marple said, setting down her knitting, "that I ought to telephone Inspector Dryden." Inspector Dryden arrived at 4 o'clock, which meant he had come from home on a Sunday afternoon, and his expression when he walked through the door suggested he had formed a view about this that he was keeping to himself with some effort. He was shown into the morning room. Miss Marple was already there, seated in the upright chair nearest the fire, which she had chosen because it was warm and because it put her facing the door, which she preferred. She had asked Mrs. Pruitt to bring tea, not because she particularly wanted tea at that moment, but because it gave the conversation a frame, and because Inspector Dryden, she suspected, was the kind of man who found things easier with a cup in his hand. He sat down across from her and looked at her with the expression of a man who has driven 20 minutes on a cold Sunday because an elderly woman telephoned and asked him to, and who is not yet certain whether this was sensible. "You said on the telephone that you had information relevant to Sir Edmund's death," he said. "I did," Miss Marple said. "Milk?" He took the milk. "I should tell you first," she said, pouring her own cup, "that Sir Edmund's death was not natural. I appreciate that, Dr. Witherspoon's assessment was that his heart was responsible, and I have no doubt that Dr. Witherspoon is a thorough and experienced physician. But Sir Edmund was poisoned. Cyanide, introduced into the brandy decanter in his study at some point during Saturday afternoon, while he was resting. Inspector Dryden put his cup down. "That is a serious claim, Miss Marple." "It is a serious matter," she agreed. "When I entered the study yesterday morning, there was a faint smell. Bitter almonds, very faint, already dispersing in the cold air. You will know that cyanide produces this smell. The brandy glass beside Sir Edmund had a residue at the bottom, consistent with a drink that had been fully consumed. The decanter, which I noticed had been returned to the tray with its stopper in place, would repay examination by your people." He was listening now with a different quality of attention. "The poison was placed in the decanter rather than the glass," Miss Marple continued. "This was deliberate. It meant the act of poisoning was separated from the act of serving. Whoever did it need not be present when Sir Edmund drank. He always had brandy in the evening. It was a habit of 40 years. The killer knew this because the killer had lived with him, or near him, for a very long time. You have a specific person in mind." "I have Miss Constance Hartley in mind," Miss Marple said. "She obtained the cyanide from a tin in the garden shed. Edmund had kept it for wasps some years ago. I would suggest you look for the tin. I doubt she disposed of it, as disposing of it would have required a deliberate trip that might have been observed, and the shed is not a place anyone goes to in winter. Dryden had produced a notebook he was writing. Her motive," Miss Marple said, "requires some background. Sir Edmund had discovered, in October of this year, that his nephew Gerald had been forging his signature on estate account transfers over a period of approximately 18 months. Mr. Fenn, the solicitor, was at minimum aware of this and may have facilitated it. Sir Edmund documented all of this in a diary which you will find in his bedroom. I have left it on the writing table there, as I thought it ought to be in your hands rather than mine." She paused. "Let him note this. Sir Edmund changed his will in response to these discoveries. He did so through a firm in Milchester, Hargreaves and Sons, rather than through Mr. Fenn, for reasons you will appreciate. The new will left the estate to charitable purposes, with modest provisions for Constance. This was a significant reduction from what Constance had expected to receive." "How significant?" "I cannot give you figures." But from what Constance told me this afternoon, she had spent 30 years managing this house, remaining in this village, in the expectation of a substantial inheritance. The new will gave her the same modest annual sum she had always received. She described it as being left nothing. Miss Marple set down her cup. I would not say her grievance was without foundation. I would say her response to it was. Dryden looked up from his notebook. She told you this herself. She did this afternoon in the drawing room. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. I should explain how that came about, because it is relevant to the quality of what she said. I did not confront her directly. I made a remark, ostensibly about my nephew's novels, about careful criminals making one assumption they ought not to have made, and about things moved when they ought not to have been moved. She responded by naming the flower arrangement on the study mantelpiece before I mentioned it. Dryden was very still. The flowers had been moved, Miss Marple said, because Constance had gone into the study in the night. This is consistent with a door Miss Vane heard between midnight and 2, to retrieve a letter from Hargreaves confirming the new will, which Sir Edmund had left behind the pewter bowl on the mantelpiece. She took the letter, intending that no one would know about the changed will, and the old one would therefore stand. She replaced the bowl slightly out of position in the dark. She did not know about the diary. She let that sit for a moment. When I raised the subject of the flowers indirectly, she identified them immediately as the thing I was referring to. A woman who had not moved them would not have known what I meant. She would have asked for clarification. Instead, she said, "You are talking about the flowers. In the study. On the mantelpiece." Miss Marple looked at the inspector calmly. After that, she told me the rest herself. I think she had been wanting to tell someone for some time. That is often the way. Dryden closed his notebook. He sat for a moment looking at the fire. "Gerald and Fenn," he said. "The forgery. That is a separate matter, and will need separate handling. But yes, the estate accounts and the transfers will give you what you need, I should think. Mr. Fenn's involvement may be harder to establish, but Gerald's will not be." She paused. Gerald did not know about his uncle's death what Constance knew. He came to this weekend believing Edmund was still unaware of the forgeries. He spent much of Saturday planning how to handle a confrontation that was no longer coming. I imagine he is rather confused about several things. She picked up her knitting bag. "I think that is everything," she said. "The tea is still warm if you would like another cup before you begin." Dryden did not arrest Constance that evening. He spoke to her first, alone in the morning room, for 40 minutes, while Miss Marple sat in the drawing room with her knitting, and listened to the quality of the silence coming through the wall. Not the words, just the rhythm of it. Dryden's voice steady and low, Constance's responses shorter, further apart as the conversation went on, and then a long stretch of quiet that was not comfortable and was not hostile but had the particular flatness of someone who has stopped arguing and started accepting. Gerald was in the hall when Dryden came out. He had been there for some time, to judge by the way he was standing, not pacing, not pretending to read the letter he held, just standing with his back against the wall in the posture of a man who has run out of ways to look natural. Dryden spoke to him briefly. Miss Marple could not hear this exchange, but she saw Gerald's face afterward, through the half-open drawing-room door. The composure went out of it in stages, like a building losing its lights floor by floor. First, the easy confidence, then the social surface, and then something underneath that was younger and considerably less certain. He sat down on the hall bench. Just sat, with the letter still in his hand, staring at the floor tiles. Mr. Fenn came downstairs at 5:30 and encountered Dryden in the hall, and the two of them went into the study and closed the door. This conversation lasted 25 minutes. When it ended, Mr. Fenn came out alone. He walked to the coat stand, put on his overcoat with the careful attention of a man performing a familiar task for what might be the last time for a while, and sat down in the chair nearest the front door with his briefcase on his knees. He did not look at Gerald. Gerald did not look at him. Dorothy appeared on the landing at 6. She had heard enough. The house was not large enough for 40 minutes of inspector's questions to go unheard by anyone paying attention, and Dorothy had been paying attention since Saturday morning. She came downstairs slowly and stood in the hall and looked at Gerald on the bench and Mr. Fenn by the door, and her face did something complicated that resolved eventually into a kind of exhausted clarity. The expression of someone who has suspected the shape of a thing for long enough that seeing it confirmed produces less shock than it ought to. She looked at Miss Marple, who had come to the drawing-room doorway. Miss Marple gave a small nod. Dorothy sat down on the bottom stair and put her face in her hands. Not weeping. Just the gesture of someone putting something down that they have been carrying for too long. Mrs. Pruitt appeared from the kitchen passage at 6:15, took in the hall with the comprehensive eye of a woman who has managed large households through various difficulties, and went back to the kitchen without a word. 20 minutes later, the smell of soup came through. A good thick vegetable, the kind that required no particular occasion and suited all of them. And Miss Marple thought that Mrs. Pruitt was, in her way, an admirable person. Constance came out of the morning room at 6:30. She was wearing her coat. She had put it on herself, and she had her handbag over her arm, and she walked into the hall with the upright bearing of a woman who has decided that whatever happens next, she will not be seen to crumble. She looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at the floor. "Huh! Gerald," she said. He looked up. She held his gaze for a moment. Whatever passed between them in that moment was not forgiveness and was not accusation. It was something older and more tired than either. The look of two people who have been bound together by circumstance for a very long time, and have now, between them, made a ruin of it. "I am sorry," she said, "that it came to this." Gerald said nothing. His mouth opened and closed once, and then he looked at the floor again, and Constance turned away and walked to the front door where Dryden was waiting. She did not look back. The door opened, and the cold air came in briefly, and then the door closed and the hall was very quiet. Miss Marple looked at the long-case clock. It was still running 3 minutes fast. She had meant to mention that to someone, and had not gotten around to it, and now it seemed less pressing than it had. Dorothy lifted her face from her hands. Her eyes were dry. "She planned it," Dorothy said, not asking, just placing the fact somewhere it could be looked at. "Yes," Miss Marple said, "while the rest of us were at dinner. While he was still alive and talking and eating his soup." She stopped. She had already done it by the time we sat down. "Yes," Miss Marple said again. There was nothing useful to add to that, and she had learned long ago that adding things to silences that did not need filling was a kindness only to the person doing the filling. Gerald stood up from the bench. He straightened his jacket with the automatic habit of a man who has spent his adult life presenting well, and the gesture was so deeply useless in the present circumstances that it was almost unbearable to watch. "I need to telephone someone," he said, "to no one in particular." He went to the study and closed the door. Mr. Fenn remained by the front door with his briefcase on his knees, waiting for whatever came next with the patience of a man who had decided that patience was the only card he had left. The soup smell drifted through from the kitchen. Miss Marple went back to the drawing room, sat down, and picked up her knitting. She had 4 rows left on the current section, and she thought she would finish them before dinner. The letter from Hargreaves and Sons arrived at Thornfield Hall on the Wednesday following, forwarded from Inspector Dryden's office with a covering note in his squared, careful hand. Miss Marple had returned to St. Mary Mead by then. The dark green rover had taken her back on Monday morning, driven this time by the same young man who had collected her, who remained as carefully uninformative as before. But Dryden had her address, and he sent it on with the note, which she thought was considerate of him. She read it at the breakfast table, as she had read Sir Edmund's invitation 3 weeks earlier, with her tea going cold beside her. The letter was from a Mr. Hargreaves, Jr., who wrote in the measured, slightly formal style of a provincial solicitor, who takes his responsibilities seriously and is mildly anxious about the circumstances in which he finds himself exercising them. He confirmed that Sir Edmund Hartley had attended his office on the 14th of November and had executed a new will witnessed by 2 members of the Hargreaves staff in full legal form. He confirmed the broad provisions: the estate and its principal assets to be placed in a charitable trust in the name of Helena Hartley, his late wife, the particulars of which Sir Edmund had specified in some detail, a sum to be paid annually to Miss Constance Hartley during her lifetime, the same sum as previously arranged, a one-time payment to Miss Dorothy Vane, described in the will as my nurse, and a woman of considerable loyalty and good sense, of an amount that made Miss Marple set her teacup down and look out at the garden for a moment. It was not a fortune, but it was enough. Enough for Dorothy to go somewhere new, or to stay somewhere familiar, or to make the sort of choices that women in Dorothy's position rarely got to make on their own terms. Mr. Hargreaves, Jr. noted, with the delicacy of a man navigating an unprecedented situation, that the existence of this will render the previous one void, and that the estate would therefore pass as Sir Edmund had intended, regardless of subsequent events. He added that he had been in contact with Inspector Dryden, and had provided all relevant documentation, and that he remained available should further clarification be required. Miss Marple folded the letter and put it beside her plate, and thought about Sir Edmund, about the man who had sat in the high-backed chair by the window, with his brandy untouched, looking at Dorothy, across the dinner table with that expression she had not been able to name. She could name it now. It was the look of a man who has recently discovered how many people around him he has failed to see clearly, and who is trying, in the time remaining, to do better. He had not had much time. Dryden's covering note was briefer. Constance had been charged. The cyanide tin had been found in the garden shed behind a bag of bone meal on the second shelf, with a residue consistent with recent use. The brandy decanter had gone to the county laboratory, and the results were expected within the fortnight, though Dryden wrote that he did not anticipate any surprises. Gerald had been interviewed at length about the estate account transfers and had, in the end, declined to say very much without a solicitor present. Not Mr. Fenn, notably, but someone brought up from London at considerable expense, Mr. Fenn himself was under investigation. Though Dryden used the word inquiries in the careful way of someone who knows the difference between what he expects to prove and what he can currently demonstrate. Dorothy, he noted, had given a full statement. She had been, he wrote, an extremely composed and precise witness. Miss Marple thought that was probably right. She looked out at her own garden, which was doing the same thing as Thornfield Hall's garden, but on a considerably smaller scale. Frost-damaged, cut back, patient. The rose she had been meaning to prune since October was still unpruned. The sweet peas she had planned to sow in February would need to be ordered. The ordinary business of things continuing, regardless. She thought about Constance. This was the part that the newspapers, when they covered these cases, never quite got right. They wrote about guilt and justice and the mechanics of the crime, and they were not wrong to do so, but they missed the thing underneath, the particular sadness of a life that had narrowed incrementally across 30 years, until the only exit a person could see was an unconscionable one. Constance had not been a wicked woman in the way that people meant when they used the word. She had been a woman with a genuine grievance who had chosen a genuine wickedness, and there was a difference even if the law, rightly, did not make one. The charitable trust would go ahead. The Helena Hartley Foundation, as it would apparently be called, was to support rural nursing services in the county, something Helena had cared about, according to the will's provisions. Dorothy had told Miss Marple, in the brief telephone conversation they had managed on Tuesday, that she thought Helena would have liked that. Miss Marple had asked. Dorothy had been quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet," she said. "I think I might go somewhere I've never been, just for a little while." A pause. "Is that foolish?" "Not in the least," Miss Marple had said. "It is, in fact, very sensible." She finished her tea, cold as it was, and picked up the Hargreaves letter once more. She read the phrase again, "a woman of considerable loyalty and good sense." Edmund, in the end, had seen Dorothy clearly. He had simply seen her too late to do anything about it while he was alive, and had done what he could in the only document that outlasted him. She folded the letter, put it in the drawer of the hall table where she kept things she might want to refer to again, though she rarely did. Outside, the first thin suggestion of spring was in the light, if not yet in the temperature. Not warm, just less dark than it had been. She went to find her gardening gloves. February came in mild and then thought better of it. Miss Marple's sweet peas were ordered, catalogued by variety in the small notebook she kept for the purpose, and arranged in order of sowing date on the kitchen windowsill, where the light was best in the morning. The unpruned rose had been pruned at last, rather more severely than she had intended, because once she had started she found the whole thing was in worse condition than it appeared from a distance, which was, she reflected, true of a good many things. Mary Mead had heard about Thornfield Hall by the second week of January, which was earlier than Miss Marple had expected, and later than she probably should have. The village had opinions, as villages do, and they were distributed in the predictable fashion. Shock, followed by the particular satisfaction of retrospective suspicion. I always thought there was something not quite right about that family, followed by a more settled, genuine unease that tended to surface in quieter conversations, when people had stopped performing their reactions and were simply left with them. Mrs. Bantry telephoned twice. The vicar mentioned it obliquely in a sermon about the parable of the prodigal son, which Miss Marple thought was not quite the right parable, but appreciated the effort. Miss Hartnell stopped her outside the post office to ask whether it was true that Miss Marple had solved the whole thing over tea, and Miss Marple said that she had simply noticed a few things and passed them along to the inspector, which was accurate as far as it went. Gerald Hartley had been charged in the 3rd week of January. The estate account transfers, once properly examined, covered 22 months and a sum considerably larger than even Sir Edmund's diary had suggested. Mr. Fenn had resigned from his firm before the new year and was, according to Dryden's brief note, cooperating with investigators in the way that people cooperate when cooperation is the only remaining currency they have. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen. The Helena Hartley Foundation had been registered with the Charity Commission. Dorothy had sent a postcard. From Lisbon, of all places, a city Miss Marple had always meant to visit, with a picture of blue and white tiles on the front and 3 sentences on the back. "Warm here, good fish. I think I may stay a little longer." Miss Marple had put it on the mantelpiece. Between the clock and the small pottery owl her nephew Raymond had brought her from somewhere, and she looked at it occasionally, with the uncomplicated pleasure of good news. Thornfield Hall itself was closed, Mrs. Pruitt had been found a position with a family in Dorchester, through the offices of someone at the county, which Miss Marple was glad of. The house stood empty behind its copper beeches, which were beginning very tentatively to show the first suggestion of bud. It would be sold eventually, she supposed. Someone would buy it and modernize it, and be very pleased with the kitchen garden and the proportions of the drawing room, and in 10 years the new family would have their own rhythms and routines, and the previous occupants would be a piece of vague local history, looked up occasionally and then set aside. That was how it went. That was always how it went. She was thinking about Constance. She had thought about Constance rather more than she had expected to. More, certainly, than she generally thought about the people whose crimes she had helped to uncover. Most of whom resolved, once the case was over, into the facts of what they had done, and ceased to be much more than that. Constance was different, and the difference was uncomfortable in a way she had examined from several angles and not quite resolved. 30 years was a long time to tend someone else's house. To stay when you might have gone, to remain useful and correct and overlooked, to watch your brother's life fill up with other people's importance, while your own contracted quietly around you. None of it justified what she had done. Miss Marple was clear on that, and she was not a sentimental woman, and she did not intend to become one. But justice and understanding were not the same thing, and she had lived long enough to know that you could hold both at once, without one cancelling the other out. The law would deal with Constance. The law was good at that. What the law could not do was account for the 30 years before. The accumulation of small diminishments that had produced, in the end, a woman capable of putting cyanide in a brandy decanter and sitting down to dinner. That part had no court and no verdict, and would not be spoken about much, because it was complicated and uncomfortable, and villages preferred their wickedness to be cleaner than that. She pulled on her gardening gloves and went out through the back door. The garden was cold but dry, and the light had the particular quality it got in February, thin and white, and somehow further away than it had been in January, which made no meteorological sense, but was true nonetheless. The rose she had pruned stood in its bed, looking reduced and necessary, the way things do after a hard cutting back. Whether it would come well in the spring, she could not yet say. She had done what she could with it, and the rest was not up to her. She found the spot near the back wall where she meant to put the sweet peas in March, and stood there for a moment looking at it. Good soil here. She had improved it over many years with the patient addition of what the compost heap provided, which was itself only the accumulation of what had been spent and broken down and turned into something useful. The garden was very good at that kind of transformation, better than most things. A robin landed on the fence post 6 feet away and looked at her with the bright, proprietorial confidence that robins always had, as though they had been there first and were tolerating the human presence on sufferance. Miss Marple looked back at it. Then she went to get the trowel, because the sweet peas would not plant themselves, and there was still a good hour of light left, and she had always found that an hour of useful work in the garden was, on balance, the best possible answer to the kind of thoughts that had no other resolution. The robin stayed on the fence post and watched her work, and said nothing, which was exactly what she required.